Nā mihi nui iho mā, kei te whakarongo mai koutou, ki te rangapaya ihu karaiti hoki, mai iti te pukapuka a ruka. Greeting friends, it's great to be with you again. It's Buckshot here. Got this week's reflection coming from the Gospel of Luke. We've been reading through Luke for quite a while now, and the verses the lectionary gives us today is chapter 12, verses 39 to 48. I'm actually filling in for Sean. He was supposed to do today's reading, but he fell ill recently and has got snowed under in his preparations to come down to the Melbourne chapter's 50th run. So I'm actually looking forward to seeing him in a few days and then spending quite a bit of time with him as we go to that run and do some other things together. But our text is one about being ready for the appearance of our Lord and also using wisely any skills or resources that we may have. I guess I've had to be ready to step in and do this due to Sean's illness. I've actually put the text below at the bottom. I'm not going to read it today because in the New Zealand church, today is actually the anniversary of the death of Torore or Waharoa, a young girl whose life and subsequent death had quite an impact on our society here. And her story flows really well with the gospel text that we have today. So I'm going to share that instead. Now, back in 2013, actually, when Sean was here in New Zealand with us, we travelled around the North Island, a few of us, and we actually were able to visit the grave of Torore at Waharoa, which is near a place called Matamata in the Waikato. And there's a couple of pictures I've stuck in that Sean took that day. It was a very poignant moment for all of us as we visited her grave and listened to her story. And as well as visiting her grave, I was actually really lucky to be living in a retreat centre a few years before that day's visit to her grave, and I spent many months, along with others, building a very special chapel, which I didn't know at the time, but on its completion was actually named after Torore. So her legacy, her story has had quite an impact on my life, and so I guess it's really nice to share that today with you. I was really looking forward to Sean's reflections though, because he was very moved that day as we stood by her grave. Back in 1830s in Aotearoa, life was pretty rugged. It was probably pretty rugged everywhere actually. But European settlers were arriving here, missionaries had landed, and many tribal groups were fighting amongst themselves as they responded to this changing world that they now found themselves in, and also guns had arrived in Aotearoa, New Zealand. Now, a mission station had been built near the family land of Torore, and she had been given a small Gospel of Luke by one of the missionaries that she kept in a flax kete, a little bag that she wore around her neck. Now, one night while her family were camping in the bush on a journey, a hostile party from another group came across their camp. In the skirmish that ensued, Torore was clubbed over the head while sleeping, and her attacker took the flax bag from around her neck, thinking it was some sort of taonga or treasure, which actually it was. When this happened, Torore was only 12 years old, so still a very young girl. Her father, Ngākuku, stood up and spoke the very next day at her funeral that there would be no utu, or revenge, sought for her death. He wanted the people to rely on divine retribution for this crime, as there had been way too much bloodshed already in tribal warring. And this concept was incredibly revolutionary at the time. For him to stand up and make this proclamation was a new idea, but it really set the scene for restoration and reconciliation between many people in time to come, eventually impacting much of Aotearoa. Now, at the time, none of the attackers could read, so the gospel text that had been stolen was of no use or impact to them initially. Eventually, though, a literate slave became part of their village and read the story of Luke to them, and they became very aware of the value of the story. Uita, who had killed Torore and stolen the book, was deeply convicted about his actions that night, He was so moved by the story of peace that Luke told that he humbled himself and went to seek out Ngā Kuku. In these days, and even now, this is a dangerous path to go down. Who knows how you will be received going to visit the parents of the person you have killed? So Uita risked his life in doing this. Utu was alive and well in those days. Now, a local retelling of what happened next relates that as Uita approached Ngā Kuku, tears were in their eyes, and the two men embraced. After Uita humbled himself and repented, peace prevailed between them. A church was even built nearby to honour the story of peace and reconciliation. But this is not the end of the story. The slave, known as Ripaho, who had read the gospel message, left this area and took with him the little gospel book with him about 500 kilometres south to the Kapiti coast. This is where I built the actual chapel, so it kind of embodies the story in its fullness. It's a real privilege to be part of that construction. Uita shared this message with the particular chief of that area, who had also been a very successful and feared warrior. This chief then sent his son off to the South Island and other places where they had enemies. The instructions were that he was to seek peace and reconciliation based on the story that Luke had been telling. And the people that Te Rapraha's son Tamihana went to visit embraced the message of Luke also. So peace became a real thing between these previously warring parties. And yet another story tells of missionaries finally arriving in the Kapiti Coast area long after Uita had taken that gospel down there, with the hope of spreading the news of Jesus amongst the people, only to find that the message had beaten them there already through this local method of transmission through Ripaho, the slave. So this is an amazing story that raises lots of questions for us. Are we ready, like Torore, to give up our lives? Are we able to recognise God doing things in indigenous ways beyond our control or even our involvement? This is a powerful story of people trusting in love and turning away from violence. Peace can never come from a gun. Only by risking all we have, like Uita did, can we find a pathway to peace. This is a tragic story where a 12-year-old girl died in tribal warfare, but the responses to her death follow the way of Jesus and opened up a way for much good to grow. I'll leave it there for you to ponder and work out how you can follow in this way in response to your own tragedy and trauma. Rangamārie me te aroha o te atua ki a tātou katoa. Cheers and God bless you all.